Hundreds of airplanes take off and land in different places on our planet every day. Air travel has become one of the most popular and frequently used means of transportation around the world. But do you know how many secrets and disasters are associated with this mode of transport? We present to your attention the top 15 mysterious and terrifying air disasters in the history of humanity. But before that, we invite you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the upcoming equally interesting videos. Let's start with the missing Boeing 777. On March 8, 2014, a Malaysian Boeing 777-200ER unexpectedly disappeared from radars while en route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. There were 227 passengers and 12 crew members on board. The weather conditions were excellent, and the radars showed no distress signals. Later, there were reports that the Boeing 777 had sunk in the territorial waters of Vietnam, approximately 250 kilometers from Tho Chu Island. However, despite a large-scale search and rescue operation, no evidence has been found to confirm any theory about the causes of the air disaster. What really happened to the missing plane remains unknown. The Boeing 777-200ER had special beacons that should have reported the plane's crash location. Unfortunately, they did not work. There was also media information that allegedly 2 Italians reported the hijacking of the plane. To this day, the main version considered is the possibility of a terrorist act on board. It was later revealed that on this flight, there were 2 passengers with stolen foreign passports in the names of Cristina Cozella and Luigi Maraldi. The well-known American publication Wall Street Journal wrote that the plane continued its flight for at least 5 hours after the communication was lost. This information was provided by the manufacturer of the Boeing's engine, which receives all the telemetry information from the planes every 30 minutes. This information was also intercepted by the U.S. Special Services. The disconnection of transmitters for civilian radars suggests a version involving the hijacking of the plane, as without radars, it could have flown unnoticed for several thousand miles. Based on this, it can be concluded that the search area expands from China to the Andaman Sea. Experts, taking into account the emergency fuel reserve, believe that the plane could have reached the coasts of East Africa. However, the Malaysian authorities have denied this information and are considering other versions of the incident, including a fire or even the pilot's suicide. The N26 Disaster in Kinshasa. On January 8, 1996, a cargo aircraft N-32B of the Russian airline Moscow Airways was on a domestic flight from Kinshasa to Kahemba. During its takeoff run, it failed to lift off the ground, exceeded the airport boundary, and entered a nearby market area, traveling about 240 meters through the trading rows before catching fire. In this disaster, 298 people died, 1 crew member and 297 people in the market area, and 5 other crew members were injured along with 253 people sustaining various degrees of injuries. To date, this air disaster remains the largest in terms of casualties and fatalities. After analyzing the investigation results, the main cause of the disaster was identified as flying with a takeoff weight exceeding the maximum permissible norm. 5 months after the hearings, the court accused the pilots of murder. On August 6, 1996, they were sentenced to 2 years of imprisonment. The Sknyliv tragedy. On July 27, 2002, an air show was held at the Sknyliv airfield on the outskirts of Lviv. It featured a Su-27 fighter jet of the Air Force. During the show, while performing high aerobatics, the jet clipped a tree, crashed to the ground, and slid across the airfield where spectators were present. The crash resulted in an explosion and a severe fire. In this catastrophe, 77 people died, including 28 children, and several hundred were injured to varying degrees. Both pilots of the crashing fighter jet managed to eject. This disaster is considered the largest in the history of air shows worldwide in terms of victims and injuries. On September 6, 2002, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense published the investigation results. The primary cause was cited as the crew's deviation from the flight task and piloting error. Later, the materials were submitted to court. On July 24, 2005, the commander of the Su-27 was sentenced to 14 years of imprisonment but was released after 11 years. The second pilot, who was on board during the disaster, received an 8-year sentence and was released after 2.5 years. Additionally, 3 officers responsible for crew preparation and flight safety also received various terms of imprisonment. The Flight 19 Squadron. This is the most famous air disaster, astonishing with its mysteries, which occurred on December 5, 1945, over the Bermuda Triangle. The training flight, named Flight 19, consisted of 5 torpedo bombers and was led by the experienced pilot Charles Taylor. On December 5, 1945, the planes took off from Fort Lauderdale base. The weather was clear that day, with no signs of impending trouble. However, an hour and a half after the flight began, the squadron deviated from its course, and the pilots lost their spatial orientation and recognition of the terrain. It was discovered from the radio communications that Taylor's compass malfunctioned, confusing Florida Keys with the Bahamas. The control center tried to redirect the planes back to Fort Lauderdale base, but due to radio interference, the pilot couldn't hear the dispatcher's instructions and continued to lead the squadron in a disorganized direction, flying further out to sea. Communication was soon completely lost, and to this day, no one knows where the planes disappeared. The theory that the disappearance was due to a lack of fuel is dismissed, as pilot Charles Taylor had ordered all planes to stay together, and any issue with fuel shortage could have been resolved at any moment. A rescue plane sent to aid Taylor's team also disappeared the same night. There were speculations that it exploded in mid-flight, as the plane simply vanished from the radar. Consequently, the squadron's disappearance is attributed to the anomalous influence of the Bermuda Triangle. Air France, Flight 447. On June 1, 2009, an Airbus A330 was operating Air France Flight 447. This aircraft was considered one of the safest in the world. However, during its flight from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, the airliner crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. There were no distress signals, and nobody knew about the incident until the pilots failed to make scheduled contact with the dispatcher. As a result of the crash, 228 people died. A 3-day mourning period was declared in France. For a long time, the cause of the crash remained a mystery. The plane's debris was scattered across the ocean floor and widely dispersed, making the investigation of the tragedy initially impossible. But in 2011, a special team was hired to collect all the remnants of the plane. The French Navy recovered 100 bodies from the ocean floor. The black boxes were also found, indicating the plane crashed due to a technical malfunction that required the autopilot to be turned off. What remains mysterious is how 3 experienced pilots lost control in a standard turbulent situation and why they kept the nose of the plane up during the descent, when in such cases, it should be lowered. Another mystery that remains unsolved: the Maraio Disaster. On March 16, 1969, a McDonnell Douglas DC-932 of Viasa Airlines was operating a flight from Caracas to Miami with a stop in Maracaibo. After takeoff, the plane gained an altitude of about 50 meters, hit a lighting tower of a basketball court, crashed into a transformer station, and exploded. Its debris flew into nearby houses, completely destroying them, and the fuel leaking from the plane caused a fire. In the air disaster, 155 people died, of which 84 were on board and 71 on the ground. This was the first and largest disaster in the history of McDonnell Douglas DC-9 airplanes, and at the time, it was the deadliest air disaster in the world in terms of the number of victims. The most logical and probable cause of the crash was determined to be faulty instruments at the airport from which the plane took off. Due to this, the crew incorrectly calculated the engine power and the maximum takeoff weight, ultimately leading to the plane being overloaded. Nonetheless, the exact cause of this air disaster remains undetermined. The Serov Bermuda. On June 11, 2012, in the Sverdlovsk region, an AN-2 plane disappeared without a trace. Neither the plane's debris, passengers, nor crew could be found for a long time. Rumors spread about the Serov Bermuda, which was already associated with the tragedy of the Dyatlov Pass group, who died under strange circumstances in the same area. The AN-2 plane was headed to the Serov aerodrome for fire monitoring of the taiga. The weather was chilly, and there was no danger of fires, so the pilot was ordered to stay at the base for a few days. Pilot Katip Kashapov decided to earn extra money by offering local residents paid tours over the taiga, taking a forced break from fire monitoring. The tragic flight took place on June 11th. Witnesses of the disaster said that the pilot was inebriated that day. Search teams could not find anything. All passengers were declared missing. The Maraio Disaster. On October 4, 1992, a cargo Boeing 747 of the Israeli airline was flying from New York to Amsterdam to Tel Aviv. A few minutes after taking off from Amsterdam, two engines of the plane suddenly broke down and the wing was damaged. Only the remaining two engines were operational. During the emergency landing approach, the Boeing 747 crashed from a height of 760 meters onto the 11-story residential complex Gruneven in the Weimar area. At that time, about 2,000 people were living in the complex. As a result of the disaster, 43 people died, 4 crew members, and 39 people on the ground. Additionally, 26 people on the ground were injured. The exact number of victims could not be established, as many illegal immigrants from Ghana and Suriname lived in the residential complex. The final investigation, released on February 24, 1994, showed that the main cause of the tragedy was metal fatigue, which led to the detachment of the engine from the wing, followed by the subsequent destruction of the aircraft structure. Flying Tiger. In 1962, Flying Tiger Flight 739, chartered by the U.S. Army, was transporting soldiers and supplies from California to Saigon, Vietnam. The aircraft refueled in Guam, but soon after takeoff, it vanished over the Philippine Sea. The weather was clear that day, with no storms forecasted, and no distress signals were received. Search efforts were unsuccessful. All 107 people aboard the missing aircraft were declared dead. The wreckage of the airliner itself was never found. There were rumors that some witnesses saw a bright flash of light near the plane's presumed location. There were also theories of sabotage on board. The most logical explanation is considered to be an engine malfunction, which supposedly lost power 3 days before the tragedy. The A310 aircraft. The disaster involving the A310 aircraft is considered one of the horrific chapters in the history of Russian aviation. On March 23, 1994, Aeroflot was operating Fleet Su-593 from Moscow to Hong Kong. A few hours after takeoff, the aircraft disappeared from the radars in the Kemerovo region. As it turned out later, the airliner was in full working order, and the weather conditions were also fine. The tragedy was caused by the negligence of the pilot, Yaroslav Kudrinsky. During the flight, neglecting all rules and instructions, he allowed his children and friends into the cockpit. He allowed his daughter and son to handle the control yoke. The crew believed that the plane was being controlled by autopilot. However, the autopilot disengaged due to the excessively rough handling of the control yoke. The pilots did not immediately realize that an emergency situation had occurred and took too long to correct it. Their behavior was unprofessional. They panicked and acted irrationally. Eventually, the plane spiraled in the air and ultimately crashed to the ground. 75 people died, 12 crew members, and 63 passengers. The investigation showed that there was a chance for survival. For that, the pilots needed to remain calm and not panic. Then the autopilot would have continued to fly the plane according to the programmed algorithm, allowing the aircraft to stabilize and safely continue the flight. In any case, it is important not to neglect safety rules at one's workplace, especially when the profession involves responsibility for people's lives. Interrupted takeoff. In 1996, a Trans World Airlines aircraft was operating Flight 800. 12 minutes after takeoff from John F. Kennedy Airport, the airliner exploded and crashed. 230 people died in the crash. It took 4 years of investigation to establish the cause of the tragedy. A fault in the electrical wiring caused a spark that ignited the fuel. While the cause seems obvious and understandable, there were witnesses who gave contradictory statements. They claimed to have seen a beam of light rising towards the plane, followed by a fireball. These accounts suggest that the aircraft was shot down by a missile during naval exercises happening simultaneously near Long Island. There is also a theory about the intervention of U.S. intelligence agencies, which allegedly concealed traces of explosives on the remains of the aircraft. Boeing 737. On January 8, 1989, a Boeing 737 of British Midland Airways was flying from London to Belfast. 14 minutes into the flight, one of the engines unexpectedly failed. This caused severe vibration on board, and the plane's controllability and stability drastically decreased. However, the pilots were relying on the second engine, as it's usually sufficient to reach the nearest airport and land. But in this situation, the instrument readings were dubious, and the pilots couldn't determine which engine was causing the flight issues. After consulting and checking the instruments, they shut down the right engine. The flight improved slightly, and the pilots prepared for an emergency landing. As the crew was aligning the plane for landing, the left engine started failing. Its power began to plummet rapidly, and the systems alerted the pilots of a fire in the engine. The pilots had to make quick decisions. They attempted an emergency landing, but the speed was too high, and the aircraft crashed into the ground near a highway. The airliner broke into 3 parts. 47 passengers died in the tragedy, and 126 others were injured. The investigation revealed that the pilots had shut down the wrong engine. Interestingly, the flight attendants and passengers saw which engine was on fire, but the pilots couldn't see it from their cockpit. Despite this, no one conveyed the information about the engine to the pilots, and the pilots didn't ask the cabin crew about it. Both pilots were penalized. After this crash, a new rule was added to aircraft operation guidelines: the necessity of communicating with passengers in the cabin to verify emergency information. The N26 Disaster near Kinshasa. On October 4, 2007, an N26 aircraft of Africa 1 was operating a cargo passenger flight from Kinshasa to Chikapa and then to Canada. During takeoff in Kinshasa, a propeller suddenly detached from the engine, after which the airliner clipped trees and fell onto residential houses, destroying them. As a result, 52 people died, including 21 people on the ground. Another 28 were injured. The only surviving crew member was the spare flight engineer. The causes of the crash were the aircraft's overload and malfunctions due to wear and tear of certain parts, as the plane had been long used in tropical regions. The DC-10 liner. On March 3, 1974, a DC-10 liner was operating a flight from Istanbul to Paris to London. 11 minutes after taking off from the French capital's airport, the plane crashed. Shortly before the disaster, air traffic controllers noticed that the point representing the plane on the radar screen had split, and communication with the liner became garbled. Meanwhile, on board the liner, there was panic. A loud bang was heard, indicating damage to the aircraft's body. Passengers in the rear row were being sucked into a hole and then ejected outside. The plane's fuel tank was fully loaded, so there were no chances of survival after the crash. 334 passengers and 12 crew members perished. The tragedy's cause was quite simple. It lies in the negligence of the ground service and crew. The employees decided not to check the hatch before the flight, which was a fatal error and led to consequences. Stardust. In 1947, another mysterious disappearance of an airplane occurred in aviation history. The Stardust liner, belonging to the British South American company, was operating a flight from Buenos Aires to Santiago, but unexpectedly disappeared in the mountainous area a few minutes before landing. In the last minutes of the flight, the radio operator transmitted a strange message. Later, a Chilean radio operator, who received the radiogram, was presumed to have made a mistake. Most likely, the message from the plane in Morse code sounded like "coming in for landing." After that, the plane completely disappeared and gave no further signals. Searches yielded no results, and the black box and debris were not found. The Stardust was a military transport version of the Avro-Lancastrian planes and could ascend to heights above 6 kilometers and reach speeds up to 500 kilometers per hour, making the passage through mountainous areas problematic. In 1998, a group of mountaineers accidentally found a fragment of an engine cowling with the inscription Rolls-Royce. This discovery prompted a renewed search for the liner, and this time the results were successful. Search teams managed to find the entire plane. After that, an official version was announced, stating that the liner had deviated from its course and crashed into the mountains due to poor visibility. These and many other unexplained air disasters continue to stir the minds of researchers and ordinary people who want to understand what really happened. We will continue to explore mysterious stories in the upcoming videos. And for now, if you liked this video, give it a like, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next video. Until next time.